Sega Dreamcast, a very special console to many of us, least of which Sega themselves, as it marked the end of their foray into the console hardware battle. But it also marked the end for another big player in the PC space, 3DFX, unaware that a battle was being waged on this very piece of hardware to contend to the power and GPU inside it, and it was something that started that pioneering relationship between console and off-the-shelf PC parts we still see today. But here we're going to compare the Dreamcast itself to its PC equivalent, which did intend to launch in 1998. Was it as good as the Dreamcast itself? How did it compete against the other competitors in the PC space? And just how difficult is it to get this to run on a Pentium 3 and Windows 98 and get those drivers to actually work? All that and more inside as we go 90s and get the fight on. We're back in the 90s, where that computing cauldron of innovation and transformation reigned. In this episode, we're going to go hands-on with a rare PC prototype graphics accelerator that was a dream come true for gamers. Or was that a nightmare? Now, as I've previously covered in my 2-plus-year-old videos of the death of 2D gaming and the i486 CPU to the resurgence of PC power in the late 90s to early 2000s, such as the TNT2, the PC 3D accelerator market was growing, and here again we're in that transformation stage with a very rare and iconic piece of history, the VideoLogic Neon 250, or the Power VR. This was the prototype board that forged Sega's final console in the Dreamcast, one of two options infamously thrown together in competition in secret to get the best bang for buck, and putting the penultimate nail in the biggest PC player of the time in 3DFX. A black belt or Highlander nonetheless, Sega chose the weaker of the two, but I'm sure not as much as the required reduction in licensing fees. Now, this is a graphics and console comparison test I've been wanting to do for many years, and it's actually only possible due to the help and support from an AMD and PowerVR architect in Reese Sommerfeld. He gave me this card free of charge, and he is the man that's made all of this possible. So I'm sure you'll join me in thanking him for making it possible. You can check him out over on Twitter and obviously over on the Beyond 3D site, which he edited for a great many years. So back to the task at hand, and just how does that Neon 250 stack up to its competitors, and specifically the Dreamcast itself? Where did it win? Where did it lose? And just what were those improvements that console space offered? This dream became a reality 24 years ago in 1998. The Dreamcast was about to launch and shift the console and gaming world at large up a few gears, closing the gap from that PC to the 32-bit console and N64 console that had been building over the previous few years. And what an impact it made, forging in many aspects we continue to take for granted even today. Predominantly built from off-the-shelf PC parts, out-of-the-box online gaming, keyboard and mouse support, cross-play, and even some things still not taken for granted now, such as upgradable parts, controller screens, and a wide selection of third-party peripherals that could be plugged in and used to expand the repertoire the console offered. It even had out-of-the-box online browser access, although those 56k modems are a thing of the past. Or 33 in our case. A big focus for Sega was cost and simplicity of development. Windows CE helped, while specifically DirectX 6 support, that enabled software to target the hardware without all that necessary getting under the hood machine coding. This was also improved from Sega's own libs to support teams and significantly eased the PC to console port by and large. In fact, many titles did use this option to just simply port the software over. Some engines literally relied on it, such as the Turok engine from Acclaim, as did using PC graphics cards to run them, with 3DFX ruling the PC roost at the time. But the then small British Imagination Technologies won the console war with their PowerVR 2 3D accelerator. The PC equivalent of the time was this Neon 250, cutbacks in places for sure, but as close as you could get to the console spec for the time. Well, almost. You see, the manufacture had been outsourced to NEC for both companies. Sega had effectively bought an IP license from Videologic for the PowerVR, a business model that Videologic would later move into. Think more 3DO than 3DFX. As Sega were largely capital constrained and NEC production constrained, this gave way to supply issues for both, meaning Sega got the first pick of hardware in a supply constrained yield. This impacted Sega's launch, as they had their most successful console launch back then, when Japan really still cared and loved consoles. This slowed the Dreamcast units and pushed the Neon 250 back to Q3, Q4 of 1999, later than the original US and European Dreamcast launches. And this is one of the impacts that changed the shape of just what this card could do in the market. Had it landed as planned in September 98 alongside the Dreamcast in Japan, then it would have competed with the all-conquering Voodoo 2, a graphics card that was intended to be inside the Dreamcast itself, a formidable force of PC dominance at the time, alongside other cards in the Revo 128, the Rage Pro, but that was not the outcome we had at the time. As it stood, the PC release in September 1999 went up against 3DFX's Voodoo 3, Nvidia's TNT2, ATI Rage's 128, and the Matrix G400 amongst others. One of the biggest increases the Dreamcast PowerVR 2 chip had over its PC parts was double the tile size for its proprietary tile-based deferred rendering, or TBDR. The ability to render the scene into chunks using the on-chip cache in a 32 by 32 point square, with the Neon 250 having to do its work within a smaller 32 by 16 rectangle. One of the many benefits is that these primitives are clipped and cooled early within the occluded triangles, never being drawn or shaded, and each pixel is only drawn once at most. This is all bus mastered and managed within the hardware and driver level. This was later adopted to some form by Nvidia with its rendering process and remains a viable and efficient rasterization method. This effectively meant that due to its local Z buffer, which was also on chip, and parallel processing, the Dreamcast could render higher resolutions or even color depth at the same performance rate, or even faster than the PC card, all things being equal. It also meant that the more dense a scene became with overdraw, the better the PowerVR 2 performed against its fill rate constrained competition. But before we go further into the technical elements this GPU and console offered, let's look at some early titles on both machines with retro shoot 'em ups all the rage. Liverpool-based, well in the early days at least, UK developer Rage were prolific in the 90s, and aside making football titles from the start and the cause of their downfall, damn you Beckham, they also made excellent arcade simulation style shooters. This 1998 Missile Command meets Choplifter PC release was a pack-in title to show off the then brand new Voodoo 2, but does an equally good job showing off how good the Neon 250 and Dreamcast's early potential was. Using height map terrain, vertex and light map based lighting, heavy and dramatic use of particle explosions, alpha blended transparencies, physics based destruction, and great sound effects, instantly feels like an arcade title, which it later became in VR format nonetheless. It was a good choice for the Dreamcast as it ticked that arcade shooter box perfectly, and although a launch title in Japan in '98, it was a year later here in Europe and the US, and in those 12 months it aged quite quickly, or at least the market moved and it was left behind. I think most played it from the pack-in Dream On demo disc than actually purchased it. I know I did, or at least I never purchased the full game until many years later. That said, it is fun and quite impressive from a variety and visual presentation point of view. Physics and interactions perspective, this still is very valid today and was still the 90s a very big driving force for when titles were pushing physics and simulation quite heavy. A lot of younger gamers think it happened in the 2000s, but it was much sooner than that. And you must give credit to the team and a reflection of some of the stagnation in gaming's focus over the years since this game's release and others around it. It also gives us a glimpse of just what the Dreamcast's potential beyond its 30 FPS cap could have been, or 25 FPS here in PAL land if so chosen. Stacked up against the PC, we can see the Dreamcast has all the settings on the maximum of the PC, which include those light maps across the vast amount of dynamic light sources such as explosions and missiles, and it includes shadows as well, a Z-based fog and both bilinear and trilinear texture filtering, which is a pretty big performance hog here, seeing performance dive on the card and in other titles by sometimes around 20-25% or upwards. In similar sections, we can see the locked 30 on Dreamcast is due to a huge amount of headroom left over as it enables that frame lock mode from the PC's menu. Something again reinforced in my modern console coverage. Aside the FPS change, both versions are doppelgangers. The potential here is to include a 60 FPS mode by disabling trilinear filtering. To me is a wasted one, as the Neon 250 can handle above 60 FPS more often in these early missions, not locked by any means, but certainly close enough to feel and look better than the 30 option it shipped with on consoles. And this is not even taken into account the improved performance headroom the Holly chipset of the Dreamcast has over the N250 card. For an early release, it boded well, but the PC here in 1998 spec is the better release due to the choice of faster frame rates up to 75 FPS right out of the box, and this can even be increased further with higher resolutions colour depth, therefore making the game look a little sharper and cleaner than the now aged looking Dreamcast release. What is this 1998 spec then? Well, at the time, in November 98, the very best CPU you could get would have been a Pentium 2 or a K62 from AMD, with the K62 being a breakthrough CPU for AMD and establishing them as a true Intel competitor and setting up the company for its fruitful future. The best specification in November would have been a 500 MHz CPU complete with AMD proprietary simmed acceleration technology, known as 3D Now. They leapfrogged Intel's MMX technology by being the first CPU to offer 32-bit single precision floating point calculations, greatly useful for the vector calculations that 3D graphics require, and it was a technology that really helped the K62 grab a foothold. Even if the instruction set and registers weren't that widely used across titles, it did beat Pentium 3's SSE to market. That was adopted at a much faster and broader range of games and rates, which meant that when 3D Now was used, then the K62 was significantly faster than the Pentium 2, but this was often not the case. And the Pentium 3 was a faster CPU overall, but that didn't launch until '99. To give us a realistic look at the best you could get, I'm using a Coppermine Pentium 3, downclocked here, old school via the front side bus jumpers on the board, to 468 MHz. This is the best we can get as the multiplier was locked on the CPU, so we have to reduce the FSB and associated PCI clocks down to 66 MHz. This means that a top-end Pentium 2 at the time would have been 100 MHz at 450 MHz frequency, so likely almost the same, a little slower, a little faster, but close enough for us to see the potential the combo could have made in the PC space at the time. Now, why is this important, I hear you ask, for a graphics accelerator analysis? Well, as I covered in my previous videos on the TNT2, the PlayStation 1, the Saturn, etc., the CPU was a much bigger cog in the 3D generation wheel back then, even than it is now, as PC still relied on it for pretty much all scene, geometry, lighting, all those workloads were all done and managed by the CPU. And it was not until the GeForce 256 and the Radeon 7000 cards when hardware TNL or transform and lighting path were possible via DirectX 7. Obviously, the PlayStation 1 was the one that ushered in the beginnings of that in the console and then later PC space. Although for many years after this, a fast CPU was still the most important element and could push much older non-TNL cards ahead of the GeForce 256, as this was a faster path, compounded by many titles not even supporting a DirectX 7 render path, so the hardware's fixed function pipeline went unused. Now for this testing and the N250, the CPU was required to set up the vertices, align the textures, light the polygons, process particles and more, which meant that the CPU could and did have a huge influence in the potential quality and performance your games could run at. This is equally true of the Dreamcast, which relied on its impressive Hitachi SH4 CPU, which could support 32 and 64-bit floats. It had simmed data processing, a superscalar dual instruction design, and a deep 5-stage pipeline. Even at only 200 MHz, it appeared slow to the PC parts at the time, but then as now, the numbers are not the whole story. Even with a much faster clocked PC CPU, the SH4 was much better at gaming functions, partly due to its RISC-based architecture and also the data it could process due to that simmed functionality being ideal for 3D and lighting workloads it was generally tasked with. Due to its FPU potential maximum of 1.4 gigaflops, higher than even a late 1999 Pentium 3 model at 1 GHz, the results may surprise many of you here, and a big reason for the impressive results at times is due to the superior specs of the Holly GPU of the Dreamcast PowerVR, but also just how fast that CPU was, meaning the GPU was often the bottleneck, which is not always the case on PC.
And thus the saga begins.
Good morning, and welcome to the Black Mesa Transit System. This automated train is provided for the security and convenience of the Black Mesa Research Facility personnel. The time is 8:47 a.m.
Now, a great PC-focused release was a huge title in 1998, and one that was in development in parallel with the Dreamcast itself. Mr. Freeman was a man in the right place at the right time, and from this point onwards he put himself and Valve on the map, right from the very beginning. This was a title that reinvigorated the PC market and drew many of us back into the high-end PC space and less focused from consoles. A game that strived new paths in game narrative, gameplay direction and production, physics, interaction, a paradigm and no mistake. But it is a title that, as I just covered, needed a very powerful CPU to get the best experience from it. And it was more a console release than a PC one in many regards due to the settings and the team's core focus. Sega were astutely aware of this, rushing and pushing to get a port over to Dreamcast as quickly as possible, getting word of mouth out in the public eye even in '99 before the US and European launches. Heavily factored around that Windows CE porting process, effectively taking the DirectX 6 version, which wasn't the best way to run the title on most GPUs anyway, and porting that over directly and quickly to the Dreamcast to get a version running. But again, then like now, the API you choose has a significant impact on the quality. The title heavily relied on scripted events, real-time cutscenes, dynamic physics-based gameplay, logical puzzles, AI-controlled enemies, and much more, making this feel like a living, breathing story you lived rather than played. It blew all of us away. You could tweak minor elements such as resolution, sound options, sprite effects, but generally you run what you brung. Fully software CPU driven support if you lacked a graphics card at all, or at least one that was good enough to run the game with D3D or the OpenGL API, and that was the biggest choice. Which one did you pick? The preferred option was obviously OpenGL, being a Quake based game, but it certainly was not just a Quake 2 title. This is a good title to show off the pretty impressive driver suite the Neon 250 shipped with, which amongst others included a mini GL optimization tool. As the card never had an ICD, much like ATI struggled with for years, you would have been left with a DirectX driver support. This tool came with some pre-rolled mini GL wrappers to improve a selection of large OpenGL titles at the time. Well, largely Quake based ones or derivatives thereof. But you could also tell it to search for a new XE and it would patch that to run under OpenGL, which may or may not offer significant performance and visual gains, and in Half-Life we get both. Sometimes when you patch the title, it actually still runs the Direct 3D version, it doesn't really run the OpenGL one at all. But under DirectX 6 here on the Neon 250, we have a title that runs without VSync by default, and even then it operates between 20 to 45 FPS. And although not terrible, the textile artifacts on geometry that can flicker and pop on many surfaces as you move the camera or walk through the world can be, at the very least, distracting and annoying. Thankfully, with this wrapper, we can force it to run under OpenGL and all these visual blemishes are removed. Solid and stable textured surfaces and no tearing. We do not see a significant increase in performance, however, it certainly improves the highs and lows, now able to fluctuate between the mid-20s and 70s with a smoother frame time graph somewhere in between those ranges and much less prone to long hangs and stutters, although some still do occur, as do the loading sectors. Capping to 30 FPS would be best here, as back when the game launched, getting a locked 60 FPS was impossible. I had pretty good build at the time, a K62, 450MHz, 256MB of RAM, 20GB drive, a 5400 HD and a powerful ATI Rage 128, and later a Matrox G400 Pro, and the game still dipped under 60 often. But the OpenGL support for ATI improved into 99 and 2000, but Nvidia was starting to really own GL games at this time with the Riva 128 and then the TNT and TNT2 cards. In 98 though, the TNT would have been the best card for Half-Life, and the Neon 250 here is on par and actually even better than that. Well, better in some ways. The Voodoo 2 and the Banshee were still very popular cards and still did a very good job. But using a more powerful TNT2 here, the M64 Pro, we can see that the frame rate can lurch far more rigidly between 30 and then 60 FPS. In most sections, it's approximately 20 to 30% faster than the Neon 250. This is at the same 16-bit color depth, although even at 640 by 480, it's not a lock 60 throughout, but it's not significantly worse at 800 by 600, at least at 16-bit. The Riva TNT would have been at least 30 to 40% slower than this, putting it below the Neon 250, and with it only having a 90MHz core, it was more fill rate limited, even if it did have a few tricks up its sleeve. One of them, which was a higher bandwidth at 128-bit, which the M64 doesn't have here. The TNT in 98 offered a twin texel pipeline, which was the reason for its name. This meant 2 pixels per clock output, or the ability to process 2 textures for the same pixel, dual ROPs and TMUs in modern terms. A key improvement for games such as Quake 2, which supported textures and light maps to enhance model and lighting quality. A key visual boost in OpenGL Quake. This is something the Neon 250 cannot achieve, as it only has a single output per pass, meaning light maps, bump maps and other additional requirements, multiple passes are needed. Now, due to the fast cache tile rendering though, this is not as expensive as it is or was on other cards at the time that waste bandwidth and raster time on pixels you'll never see. This is still true today. Take the TNT2 here, which is more powerful card in raster time. Effectively, the M64 Pro has the N250 beat, 125 million pixels and texels per second for the PowerVR 2, with the TNT2 delivering twice that at 250 million. Now this is due to that twin output process the TNT2 had, as did the TNT, and actually if it was just single textures, it could actually render 2 at the same time because it is 2 dual pipes. But at this time things had moved on with dual textures, bump maps, light maps, so this wasn't a common factor at all. Overall, the fill rate here on the Neon 250 is half what it is on the TNT2 M64 here, which also has a 64-bit bandwidth, meaning the TNT2 is still on paper 38% faster than the older Riva TNT. So overall, this should be a much faster card than the PowerVR 2, clearly. Well, not always, and what we see is the TNT2 is better, obviously, but nowhere near 2 times, and it can actually be worse at certain points. The API is certainly playing a factor here, with the Neon 250 wrapper being excellent. It's actually far superior than the Dreamcast running DirectX 6 under that hardware zapping Windows CE. As I just covered, under Windows 98 and that DX6 overall performance is worse than OpenGL, which we can see that some of the delta we are seeing here between Dreamcast and PC is down to that. I would estimate around 20-ish plus % Windows CE is impacting it, and it's likely a similar 20% or more on top of that with the API. But memory is a big issue here on the console. Being double buffered when the Neon 250 is almost certainly triple buffered makes another win for PC. 32 megabytes of VRAM is 4 times the amount the Dreamcast has, and recall the main CPU RAM of 16 megabytes is not unified and is of no use for the Holly GPU. All these combine to show that although the Dreamcast can still operate at 60 FPS, it is normally around 20 to 50% slower than the N250 here, with some sections being very close and equally as bad, as you see here, and then pretty much others are 2 times faster on the PC. The port under CE clearly has issues, and I have completed a much deeper review of Half-Life against this version and many other versions to go far more into the weeds, and if you are a patron you can watch that around about now. But if you're not, then you can join from just £1 a month to support this kind of deep dive technical work and obviously myself. But overall here the results are a game that on face value looks, plays and is almost identical to the PC release from 1998 with some improvements. What lets it down is the varied and thus inconsistent performance throughout. Terribly awkward controls with the Dreamcast pad, mouse and keyboard is really the only option, which transforms it night and day. But it also has horrendous loading, much worse than the original title on PC, with obvious memory constraints, making it a generally worse experience than even the N250 would manage at the time. It could have been so much better, but alas, a game delayed is still not a guarantee of greatness, it seems, although this one never launched, so they did obviously understand that. It's another one here for the PC tally, and the Neon 250 takes another chalk in that lineup of titles, winning 2 for 2 at this point. But there's much more to dive into with this genuine revelatory title, and please check out my other video if you can.
It's good to see you. Gordon, here you are. We just sent a sample down to the test chamber.
We've boosted the anti-mass spectrometer to 105%. Bit of a gamble, but we need the extra resolution.
The administrator is very concerned that we get a conclusive analysis of today's sample. I gather they went to some lengths to get it.
They're waiting for you, Gordon, in the test chamber.
It's probably not a problem. Probably, but I'm showing a small discrepancy in... well, no, it's well within acceptable bounds again. Sustaining sequence. Well, there goes our grant money.
We may have completed Half-Life, but we're not even halfway through. And another segue here is the image quality you are seeing today. Well, hold up, that's the end of part 1. But if you enjoyed this and already can't wait for part 2, then if you are a patron, you can already go and watch it as it's already up. But if you're not, you can join for a few pounds or dollars, and you can see all the lovely patrons that make this video and others like it possible. So if you like what I do and like to continue the quality, then join my Patreon. It really helps support me. You can see the rest of this and other exclusive early access footage, and even give a chance to put some questions to me on my database video. But for now, I'm out, but don't worry, the retro will continue rolling, and I'll be back very soon in part 2.